the metal blade pressed against his throat hard enough to draw blood. But Benjamin Dawson did not flinch as the bandit demanded every last coin he carried, which amounted to $3.42 after 4 years of saving for something that mattered more than his own life. Benjamin had been riding the trail between Columbia, California, and the neighboring ranch where he worked, his saddlebags heavy with the careful accumulation of nearly every wage he had ever earned, when 3 men on horseback had surrounded him in the fading light of dusk. They took his visible money, but somehow missed the leather pouch sewn into the lining of his worn saddle, where $873 rested in carefully folded bills and gold coins, the sum total of his dreams rendered in currency that represented thousands of hours of backbreaking labor under the unforgiving California sun. The year was 1859, and Columbia had transformed from a sleepy mining camp into a thriving town where fortunes were made and lost with the capricious whims of fate. Benjamin had arrived here as a 17-year-old boy with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hunger for something better than the poverty that had claimed his parents back in Missouri. 6 years had passed since then. 6 years of working from dawn until well past dark, tending cattle and mending fences and breaking horses that other men were too afraid to approach. He had saved his wages with a discipline that bordered on obsession, denying himself every comfort and luxury, eating the simplest meals and wearing clothes until they were more patch than original fabric. The land he wanted sat just 3 miles outside of town, 160 acres of good grazing land with a creek that never ran dry and enough timber to build a decent house and barn. Old Marcus Thornfield had agreed to sell it to him for $900, a fair price in a region where good land was becoming increasingly scarce as more settlers poured into California with dreams of gold and prosperity. Benjamin had been just $27 short of his goal, planning to make up the difference with his wages from the current month, when fate had intervened in a way he could never have anticipated. The bandits rode off with his pocket change, laughing at the skinny cowboy who apparently had nothing worth stealing, and Benjamin continued his journey into Columbia with his heart pounding and his hands shaking from the rush of adrenaline. He had come so close to losing everything, and the near miss made him realize just how fragile his carefully constructed plans truly were. The sun had set completely by the time he reached the outskirts of town, and the main street was lit with oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the wooden sidewalks and false-fronted buildings. Benjamin guided his horse toward the livery stable, intending to bed down in the loft as he usually did when he came to town, saving the cost of a hotel room. The stable owner, a grizzled man named Pete who had lost his left arm in a mining accident, greeted him with a nod and took the reins. Benjamin unsaddled his horse personally, his fingers working with practiced efficiency to remove the saddle and reveal the hidden pouch that contained his life savings. He transferred it to an inner pocket of his coat, buttoning it securely, before heading out into the cool evening air. Columbia's Main Street was unusually crowded for a weeknight, with clusters of men gathered in animated conversation outside the saloons and general stores. Benjamin caught fragments of their discussions as he walked past, something about an auction scheduled for the next day, something about a spectacle that would draw people from miles around. He paid little attention to the gossip, his mind occupied with calculations about when he could complete his land purchase and begin building the life he had envisioned for so long. The general store was still open, its windows glowing with warm lamplight, and Benjamin stepped inside to purchase the few supplies he needed: flour, coffee, a small sack of beans, nothing extravagant but enough to keep him fed for another week. The proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had always treated him kindly despite his shabby appearance, wrapped his purchases in brown paper and tied them with string. "You heard about tomorrow's auction, Benjamin?" she asked as she counted out his change. "Caught a few words on the street, but I was not paying much attention," he admitted, pocketing the coins carefully. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted to something between disgust and resignation. "That snake oil salesman who rolled into town last week, turns out he was transporting more than just his fake medicine. Had a girl locked in a wagon cage, claimed she was sold to him legally to settle her father's debts. Sheriff looked into it, and apparently the paperwork is legitimate, signed by some judge down in Los Angeles. Now he is auctioning her off tomorrow afternoon to the highest bidder, calling it a repayment of his investment." Benjamin felt his stomach turn at the words. He had heard of such things happening, particularly in the chaotic years following the gold rush when laws were loosely enforced and desperate people made terrible bargains, but he had never witnessed it firsthand. "The sheriff is allowing this. Says his hands are tied if the papers are legal," Mrs. Henderson replied with a bitter edge to her voice. "There will be a crowd tomorrow, you can be sure of that. Men coming to gawk and bid, treating a human being like livestock. It makes me sick to think about it, but what can decent folk do? We live in a world where money talks louder than morality." Benjamin left the store with a heavy feeling in his chest, the joy of nearly reaching his savings goal now tainted by the knowledge of what would unfold the next day. He returned to the livery stable and climbed the ladder to the loft, where he spread his bedroll in the sweet-smelling hay. Sleep came slowly that night, his thoughts churning with images of a girl trapped in a cage, her fate to be decided by the greed and lust of strangers. Morning arrived with the crow of a rooster somewhere in the distance, and Benjamin woke to find pale sunlight streaming through gaps in the stable walls. He performed his morning routine with mechanical efficiency, washing his face in the trough outside and combing his dark hair with his fingers. His reflection in the water showed a face weathered beyond its 23 years, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a jaw that needed shaving. He had inherited his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes, a combination that women might have found handsome if he ever bothered to clean himself up properly. The day stretched before him with a list of errands to complete before he could return to the ranch. He needed to pick up a new bridle that the saddle maker had been repairing, deliver a message to the bank on behalf of his employer, and purchase a few other odds and ends. Benjamin went about these tasks with his usual quiet efficiency, speaking only when necessary and keeping his eyes on his own business. He had learned early in life that drawing attention to yourself rarely led to anything good. By early afternoon, a crowd had begun gathering in the town square near the courthouse. Benjamin tried to avoid the area, but his errands conspired to keep him nearby, and he found himself drawn toward the commotion despite his better judgment. A makeshift platform had been erected in the center of the square, and the snake oil salesman stood upon it with the grandiose bearing of a man who believed himself clever and important. He wore a garish suit of purple velvet with gold buttons, and his oiled hair gleamed in the afternoon sun as he called out to the assembling crowd. "Gentlemen, gentlemen, gather around for an opportunity that comes but once in a lifetime," the salesman bellowed, his voice carrying across the square with practiced projection. "I have here legal documentation proving ownership of one female, aged 19 years, healthy and strong, suitable for household duties or whatever other purposes a man might require. The bidding will commence shortly, and I assure you this is a completely legitimate transaction, approved by the appropriate legal authorities. Benjamin felt his jaw clench as he listened to the repulsive speech. Against his better judgment, he moved closer to the platform, drawn by a morbid need to witness what kind of monster would treat another human being this way. The salesman gestured dramatically, and two rough-looking men emerged from a covered wagon pulling a smaller cage on wheels. Inside the cage, visible to everyone in the crowd, sat a young woman with tangled auburn hair and a face that might have been beautiful if not twisted with fear and exhaustion. She wore a simple dress that had once been blue but was now stained and torn, and her hands gripped the bars of her cage with white-knuckled intensity. Even from a distance, Benjamin could see the defiance in her eyes, the spark of spirit that had not yet been extinguished by her terrible circumstances. She scanned the crowd with a look of desperate calculation, as though searching for someone who might help her, might see her as a person rather than property. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Benjamin felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that defied logic or explanation. He saw in her gaze not just fear, but also intelligence and strength, qualities that should never be caged or sold. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, but Benjamin found himself unable to look away as the salesman began the auction with exaggerated ceremony. "We shall start the bidding at $100, the salesman announced. "A bargain price for such a fine specimen, I assure you." A portly man near the front of the crowd raised his hand immediately. $100, he called out, his voice thick with anticipation that made Benjamin's skin crawl. $150. Another voice countered from the opposite side of the square. The bidding continued, climbing steadily as more men joined in, their faces flushed with excitement and something darker that Benjamin did not want to name. He watched the girl's expression change from defiance to despair, as the price climbed higher, and the reality of her situation became inescapable. Her fingers loosened their grip on the bars, and her shoulders sagged as though the weight of her fate had finally broken her spirit. $500, a well-dressed man in a black suit announced, his tone confident and final. The crowd murmured, impressed by the sum, and the salesman grinned with greedy satisfaction. $500, gentlemen. Do I hear $550? This is your last chance to acquire this remarkable opportunity. Benjamin's hand moved to his coat pocket, his fingers touching the leather pouch that contained his dreams, his future, everything he had worked toward for 6 long years. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to preserve what he had earned through such sacrifice, to remember that one man could not fix all the world's injustices. But his hand was already removing the pouch, his voice already cutting through the murmur of the crowd before his rational mind could stop him. $900, Benjamin called out, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The square fell silent, every head turning to locate the source of this unexpected bid. The girl in the cage looked up sharply, her eyes finding Benjamin's face in the crowd with an expression of such desperate hope that it made his chest ache. The man in the black suit turned to glare at him, clearly trying to determine if this was a serious challenge or the ramblings of a drunk. "Did you say $900, sir?" the salesman asked, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "I did," Benjamin confirmed, stepping forward so that everyone could see he was serious. $900 in gold and cash, right here in my pocket. The man in the black suit looked Benjamin up and down, taking in his worn clothes and dusty boots, clearly doubting that such a man could possess that kind of money. "Let us see proof of these funds," he demanded. "I will not be outbid by someone playing games." Benjamin walked to the platform and climbed the steps, aware of every eye upon him. He opened the pouch and poured its contents onto a small table the salesman hastily provided, the gold coins gleaming in the sunlight and the bills making a satisfying pile. The salesman's hands trembled as he counted the money, his tongue darting out to wet his lips in excitement. $973, the salesman announced after completing his count. Gentlemen, we have a bid of $900. Do I hear 950? The man in the black suit stared at the money on the table, his face reddening with anger. He clearly wanted to continue bidding, but $900 was already an extravagant sum, and going higher would be foolish pride. After a long moment, he shook his head and turned away, muttering curses under his breath. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the worn hat for $900, the salesman declared, slamming his hand on the table for emphasis. Sir, if you would complete the paperwork, the property is yours. Benjamin forced himself to sign the documents that transferred ownership, his hand steady even as his mind reeled from what he had just done. He had thrown away 6 years of saving in a matter of minutes, destroyed his carefully laid plans for a piece of land, and a house, and a future that now seemed as distant as the stars. But as he approached the cage and the salesman handed him the key with a knowing wink that Benjamin wanted to punch off his face, he knew with absolute certainty that he could not have made any other choice. The girl watched him unlock the cage door, her expression unreadable as he swung it open and offered his hand to help her step down. She hesitated for just a moment before accepting his assistance, her fingers cold and trembling in his palm. Up close, Benjamin could see the freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks, the way her auburn hair caught copper highlights in the sun, and the fear that still lingered in her green eyes despite the defiance she was trying to project. "Can you walk?" Benjamin asked quietly, aware of the crowd still watching them with varying expressions of curiosity, disappointment, and approval. "Yes," she replied, her voice hoarse as though she had not spoken in days. "Thank you. I do not know why you did this, but thank you." Benjamin did not know how to answer that, so he simply nodded and guided her away from the platform, through the crowd that parted reluctantly before them. He could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispers that followed in their wake, but he focused on putting distance between them and that awful square. The girl stumbled once, her legs unsteady after days confined in the cage, and Benjamin steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Where are we going?" she asked as they turned down a side street away from the main thoroughfare. "Somewhere you can clean up and eat something," Benjamin said, his mind racing to figure out exactly what that somewhere might be. He could not take her back to the ranch without explanation, and he doubted any hotel would rent a room to a man and woman who were not married. Mrs. Henderson might help, he thought, remembering her expression of disgust when she had spoken of the auction. They walked in silence to the general store, and Benjamin was relieved to see Mrs. Henderson behind the counter when they entered. The older woman's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the girl, her gaze moving to Benjamin's face with a question he could see forming. "I bought her freedom," Benjamin explained simply. "She needs somewhere safe to stay and some proper food. I am hoping you might know someone who could help with that." Mrs. Henderson came around the counter immediately, her face softening as she looked at the girl. "You poor dear, what you must have been through. Come with me to the back room, we will get you cleaned up and fed. Benjamin, you did a good thing today, probably the only man in this town with the courage to stand up for what is right." The girl looked back at Benjamin as Mrs. Henderson led her away, and he saw confusion mixed with gratitude in her expression. He waited in the front of the store, suddenly exhausted from the adrenaline and the weight of what he had done. When Mrs. Henderson returned alone 20 minutes later, She found him sitting on a barrel near the window, his head in his hands. "She is washing up and eating some bread and cheese," Mrs. Henderson reported, pulling up a chair beside him. "Now you want to tell me what you are planning to do." "That girl has papers saying you own her, which means you are responsible for her by law." "I know," Benjamin said, lifting his head to meet her eyes. "I have not thought that far ahead yet. I just could not stand there and watch her be sold to someone who would treat her like property. Now I have no money for the land I wanted, no clear plan, and a girl whose life I am somehow responsible for." "What is your name, son?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "Benjamin Dawson, madam." "Well, Benjamin Dawson, first things first. That girl needs proper clothes and shoes, and you need to figure out where she is going to sleep tonight. My house has a spare room, and my husband and I would be happy to let her stay with us for a few days while you sort things out. As for the rest, sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of the future you planned and trusting that something better will come along." Benjamin felt a knot loosen in his chest at her words. "I would be grateful if you could house her for a few days, madam. I can pay you something once I collect my wages at the end of the month." "Nonsense. We will do it because it is the decent thing to do. Now let me get her some proper clothes from my stock here, and you can come back tomorrow to check on her and figure out the next steps." The girl emerged from the back room looking transformed, her face clean and her hair brushed into some semblance of order. She had splashed water on her dress to remove the worst of the stains, but it was still clearly in need of replacement. Mrs. Henderson immediately set about finding clothes that might fit, pulling dresses from shelves and holding them up for comparison. "What is your name, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she worked. "Lillian Vance," the girl replied, her voice stronger now that she had food and water in her stomach. "My father was James Vance, a farmer down near Los Angeles. He borrowed money from that salesman to buy seed for crops that failed, and when he could not repay the debt, he signed papers putting me up as collateral. He died 2 months ago, never knowing what would become of me." "That is a terrible burden to carry," Mrs. Henderson said sympathetically. "But you are safe now, thanks to Benjamin here. He spent every penny he had saved for years to buy your freedom." Lillian turned to look at Benjamin with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Why would you do that for someone you do not even know?" Benjamin struggled to find words that would explain what he himself did not fully understand. "It was not right, what was happening to you. I could not just stand by and let it happen, not when I had the means to stop it." "But you said he spent his savings," Lillian said, looking back at Mrs. Henderson. "What was the money for?" "Land," Benjamin admitted. "I was going to buy a piece of property outside town, build a ranch of my own. I was $27 short of having enough, and then I saw you in that cage and nothing else seemed to matter anymore." Something shifted in Lillian's expression, a dawning realization of the magnitude of his sacrifice. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her freshly cleaned cheeks, and she turned away as though embarrassed by her emotion. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry that saving me cost you your dreams." "Do not apologize," Benjamin said firmly, moving closer but not touching her, aware that she had probably been through enough at the hands of men. "I made a choice and I would make it again. Dreams can be rebuilt, but some chances to do the right thing only come once." Mrs. Henderson tactfully busied herself with wrapping the new clothes in paper while Lillian composed herself. When she turned back around, her eyes were still red, but her chin was lifted with that same defiance Benjamin had seen in the cage. "Then I will help you rebuild those dreams," she declared. "I am strong and I can work. Whatever you need, I will do it to help you get your land back. Right now what you need is rest and safety," Benjamin said. Mrs. Henderson has offered to let you stay with her and her husband for a few days while we figure out the next steps. Tomorrow I need to go back to the ranch where I work and explain to my employer what happened. After that, we can talk about the future." Lillian nodded, accepting the package of new clothes from Mrs. Henderson with obvious gratitude. The older woman led her toward the door, promising Benjamin that she would take good care of the girl, and that he should come by the following evening after he had sorted things out at the ranch. Benjamin watched them go, feeling as though he had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to discover whether he would fly or fall. He spent the night in the livery stable again, but sleep was even more elusive than the night before. His mind kept returning to the moment when his eyes had met Lillian's across the crowd, the instant when his carefully ordered life had been thrown into chaos. He had never been an impulsive man, had always prided himself on his discipline and self-control, but something about seeing her trapped and helpless had bypassed all his rational thinking and gone straight to his heart. The ride back to the ranch the next morning took 3 hours through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and grazing cattle. The ranch belonged to a man named Harold Whitmore, who had hired Benjamin 6 years ago based on nothing more than the determination he saw in a skinny teenager's eyes. Harold was a fair employer, gruff but honest, and Benjamin had worked hard to prove worthy of the trust placed in him. Now he had to explain why he had spent all his savings on something that had nothing to do with the goals they had discussed many times over the years. Harold was working in the corral when Benjamin arrived, his weathered face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and raised a hand in greeting, then frowned as he took in Benjamin's expression. "You look like a man with a heavy story to tell," he observed. "Come on up to the house, and we will talk over coffee." They sat on the porch of Harold's modest ranch house, cups of strong black coffee steaming in their hands, while Benjamin explained everything that had happened in Colombia. Harold listened without interruption, his craggy face revealing nothing of his thoughts until Benjamin finished speaking. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity before the older man finally spoke. "That was either the bravest or the dumbest thing you have ever done, and I am not entirely sure which," Harold said slowly. "You threw away 6 years of saving for a girl you never met before yesterday." "I know it sounds crazy when you say it like that," Benjamin admitted. "But I could not do anything else, Harold. If I had walked away and let her be bought by someone who would abuse her, I would never have been able to look at myself in a mirror again." Harold took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes studying Benjamin with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Your heart was in the right place, I will give you that. But now you have got a situation that needs managing. This girl, Lillian, what are your intentions toward her?" "I do not know," Benjamin said honestly. "I bought her freedom because it was the right thing to do, not because I had any plans beyond that. She is staying with a kind woman in town for now, and I promise to help figure out what comes next." "You realize that legally you own her until you sign papers releasing her from that contract," Harold pointed out. "In the eyes of the law, she is your responsibility. You cannot just set her loose without any means of support and expect things to work out fine." Benjamin had been trying not to think about that particular complication, but Harold was right. Simply tearing up the papers would not give Lillian real freedom if she had nowhere to go and no way to support herself. "What would you suggest?" he asked, genuinely seeking advice. "Well, first off, you are going to need money to get back on your feet, which means you are going to need to keep working here for the foreseeable future," Harold said practically. "Second, if this girl is willing to work like she says, I could use another set of hands around here. My wife Martha has been after me to hire someone to help with the household and garden. and the bunkhouse has an empty room that could be fixed up proper for a woman. It would give Lillian a place to stay and a way to earn her keep, and it would let you two figure out what kind of relationship you are going to have without the pressure of being dependent on strangers. The offer was more generous than Benjamin had any right to expect, and he felt a surge of gratitude toward the man who had been more like a father to him than his own father had managed to be. "Are you sure, Harold? That is asking a lot, bringing a stranger onto your property." "Martha and I do not have children of our own, and we have got plenty of room," Harold said with a shrug. "Besides, you have proven yourself to be a good judge of character over the years. If you thought this girl was worth saving, I am inclined to trust your judgment. Bring her out here at the end of the week, and we will see how things go." Benjamin rode back to Columbia that same evening, his heart lighter than it had been since the auction. He found Lillian sitting on Mrs. Henderson's front porch, wearing one of the new dresses and looking more like a normal young woman than the desperate prisoner he had freed from the cage. She stood when she saw him approaching, her expression anxious as though she had been afraid he might not come back. "I spoke with my employer," Benjamin said without preamble, swinging down from his horse. "He has offered you a position helping his wife with household work and tending the garden. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board in a separate building from the men's bunkhouse. You would have your own space and your independence, and it would give you time to figure out what you want to do with your future." Lillian's face lit up with an expression of such relief and hope that Benjamin felt his breath catch. He would do that for someone he has never met. "Harold is a good man and he trusts my judgment," Benjamin explained. "The work will not be easy, but it will be honest and you will be safe. If you are willing, I can take you out there at the end of the week." "I am more than willing," Lillian said emphatically. "When can we leave?" "I do not want to impose on Mrs. Henderson's hospitality any longer than necessary. End of the week, like I said. That gives you a few more days to rest and regain your strength. Mrs. Henderson does not mind having you, and you have been through an ordeal that deserves some recovery time." They talked for over an hour on that porch, the conversation flowing more easily than Benjamin would have expected. Lillian told him about growing up on her father's farm, about the crops that had failed 3 years in a row due to drought, and how her father had grown increasingly desperate to find a solution. She spoke of the salesman arriving like an answer to prayers, offering money with what seemed like reasonable terms, and how quickly everything had fallen apart when the harvest failed again. "My father was not a bad man," Lillian said softly, her eyes focused on some distant memory. "He was just desperate and foolish, and he paid for his mistakes with his life. I think the stress of what he had done to me, the knowledge that he had essentially sold his daughter, broke something in him. He took sick about a month after signing those papers, and he was gone within 3 weeks." "I am sorry you went through that," Benjamin said, meaning it with his whole heart. "No one should have to carry that kind of burden." "Tell me about your dreams for the land," Lillian said, clearly wanting to shift the conversation to something less painful. "What were you going to build there?" Benjamin described his vision with more detail than he had ever shared with anyone, painting a picture of the ranch he had imagined during all those long hours of work. He spoke of the house he wanted to build, not large but solid and well-made, with windows that would let in the morning sun and a porch where someone could sit and watch the sunset. He talked about the cattle he would raise, the horses he would train, the garden that would provide vegetables, and the fruit trees he would plant that might someday shade children playing beneath their branches. "It sounds beautiful," Lillian said when he finished, her voice wistful. "And I took all of that away from you." "You did not take anything," Benjamin corrected firmly. "I made a choice and I do not regret it, Maybe it will take me another 6 years to save up enough money again, or maybe something else will come along. Either way, I will figure it out." The days until the end of the week passed in a strange sort of limbo. Benjamin returned to his regular work at the ranch, falling back into the familiar rhythms of tending cattle and mending fences. But his mind was constantly drifting back to Columbia and the girl waiting there. He found himself thinking about the way Lillian's eyes lit up when she smiled, the determination in her voice when she talked about working to help him rebuild his dreams, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive an ordeal that would have broken many others. Harold noticed his distraction and commented on it with his typical bluntness. "You are thinking about that girl a lot for someone who claims he just wanted to do the right thing." "I am just worried about how things will work out," Benjamin protested, but even to his own ears the excuse sounded weak. "Son, I have been around long enough to recognize a man who is falling in love, even if he has not figured it out himself yet," Harold said with a knowing grin. "Nothing wrong with that, mind you. Just be honest with yourself and with her about what you are feeling." Benjamin wanted to deny it, to insist that his interest in Lillian was purely humanitarian, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was that he had been thinking about her constantly, not just with concern for her well-being, but with a growing awareness of how much he wanted to see her smile, to hear her voice, to learn everything there was to know about the person she was beneath the trauma she had experienced. It terrified him, this feeling that had bloomed so quickly and so intensely, but he could not seem to stop it any more than he could stop the sun from rising. When the end of the week finally arrived, Benjamin rode into Columbia with his heart hammering in his chest like he was heading to something momentous rather than simply collecting a passenger. Lillian was waiting with a small bundle of belongings that Mrs. Henderson had helped her assemble, wearing a practical calico dress and a bonnet that shaded her face from the sun. She looked nervous but determined as she said her goodbyes to Mrs. Henderson and accepted Benjamin's hand up onto the horse he had borrowed for her to ride. The journey to the ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country in California. Rolling hills covered in golden grass and clusters of oak trees that provided welcome shade from the afternoon heat. Benjamin pointed out landmarks along the way, showing Lillian the boundaries of various properties and explaining which ranchers were honest and which ones bore watching. She listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that showed she understood the complexities of ranching life. "That piece of land you wanted to buy," Lillian said as they crested a hill that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "Is it visible from here?" Benjamin hesitated, then pointed to a section of land in the middle distance where a creek glinted silver in the sunlight. "That is it there, the 160 acres between the creek and that line of oak trees. Old Marcus Thornfield still owns it, but I do not know if he will hold it for me while I save up again. He might sell it to someone else who has the money now." Lillian stared at the land for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "It is beautiful," she said finally. "I can see why you wanted it so badly. We will get it back for you somehow, Benjamin. I promise you that." "You do not owe me anything," Benjamin said, uncomfortable with the idea of her feeling indebted. "I did what I did because it was right, not because I expected anything in return." "I know that," Lillian replied, turning to look at him with those piercing green eyes. "But it does not change the fact that I want to help you. You gave me my life back when you had no reason to, and that is not something I will ever forget or take lightly." They arrived at the ranch in the late afternoon, and Martha Whitmore came out to greet them with a warm smile that immediately put Lillian at ease. Martha was a sturdy woman in her 50s with gray, streaked brown hair and a no-nonsense manner that masked a genuinely kind heart. She sized Lillian up with a quick glance and seemed to approve of what she saw. "Welcome to the ranch, dear," Martha said, taking Lillian's bundle and ushering her toward a small building set apart from the main bunkhouse. "This will be your room, and you can settle in before supper. We eat at 6 o'clock, and I expect you are hungry after that long ride." The room was simple but clean, with a bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window that looked out toward the western hills. Lillian set down her bundle and turned to Martha with visible emotion. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mrs. Whitmore. I will work hard and prove that your faith in me is justified." "I am sure you will, dear," Martha said kindly. "Now get yourself washed up and rested, and we will talk more over supper about what your duties will be." Benjamin left them to their conversation and headed to the bunkhouse, where he shared a room with two other ranch hands. His friends Jake and Samuel greeted him with curiosity, having heard rumors about what had happened in Colombia and eager for confirmation. Benjamin gave them the basic facts without embellishing, emphasizing that Lillian was there to work and deserved to be treated with respect. "She must be something special for you to throw away all your savings," Jake observed, a tall man with a perpetual sunburn and a friendly grin. "When do we get to meet her?" "At supper, I imagine," Benjamin said, unpacking his saddlebags. "And she is not something I threw away my savings for. She is someone whose freedom I purchased. There is a difference." "Sounds like Benjamin has gone sweet on a girl," Samuel teased, earning himself a glare. Samuel was shorter and stockier than Jake, with black hair and a beard he was constantly trimming. "Nothing wrong with that, friend. Just interesting to see you all protective and defensive." Benjamin wanted to argue, but he knew his friends well enough to recognize that protests would only fuel their teasing. He changed into cleaner clothes and combed his hair, telling himself it was just basic courtesy and had nothing to do with wanting to look presentable for Lillian. The face that looked back at him from the small mirror above the washstand was still weathered and work-worn, but at least he looked clean and respectable. Supper that evening was a slightly awkward affair, with everyone trying not to stare at Lillian while simultaneously being curious about the newcomer. Martha had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and the conversation around the table gradually relaxed as people realized Lillian was not some fragile creature who would fall apart under scrutiny. She answered questions about her background with honest directness, neither hiding her circumstances nor dwelling on them with self-pity. Harold dominated much of the conversation, explaining to Lillian what her duties would entail and what the expectations were for anyone living and working on his ranch. She would help Martha with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and maintaining the vegetable garden, and in exchange she would receive room, board, and a small wage that she could save or spend as she saw fit. The terms were generous, more generous than most women in her position could expect, and Lillian clearly understood and appreciated that fact. "I want to learn everything I can about ranching," Lillian said during a lull in the conversation. "If it is not too much trouble, I would like to understand how the whole operation works, not just the household parts." Harold raised his eyebrows in surprise. "That is an unusual request from a woman, but I do not see why not. Benjamin here knows just about every aspect of running a ranch, and I am sure he would be willing to teach you when time allows." Benjamin felt multiple pairs of eyes turn toward him, and he nodded slowly. "I can do that, if you are serious about learning." "It is hard work, though, not something most people take to easily." "I am serious," Lillian confirmed. "I do not want to be dependent on anyone's charity forever. I want to understand how to make a living from the land, how to be self-sufficient. Maybe someday I can have my own small place, or at least be useful enough that I can always find work. The respect in Harold's expression deepened at her words. I like your attitude, young lady. We will see what we can teach you. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm for everyone at the ranch. Lillian proved to be everything she had claimed, a hard worker who approached every task with determination and a willingness to learn. She rose before dawn to help Martha prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent her mornings tending the garden and doing laundry, and devoted her afternoons to whatever tasks needed doing. Martha grew fond of her quickly, commenting to Harold that having another woman around made the ranch feel more like a proper home. Benjamin found himself spending more and more time teaching Lillian about ranching, showing her how to recognize healthy cattle, how to mend tack, how to read the weather signs that predicted rain or dry spells. She absorbed information like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and remembering everything he told her. Their lessons often extended into the evening hours, sitting on the porch of the main house and talking about everything from cattle breeding to the history of California. You are a good teacher, Lillian told him one evening as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. You explain things in a way that makes sense without making me feel stupid for not knowing. You are not stupid, Benjamin said firmly. You just did not grow up around ranching. There is a difference. My father tried to teach me about farming, but I never had much aptitude for it, Lillian admitted. This feels different, though. Maybe it is because I am choosing to learn instead of being forced, or maybe it is because you make it interesting. Either way, I am grateful. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset fade into twilight. Benjamin found himself acutely aware of Lillian's presence beside him, the way her hair escaped from its pins to curl around her face, the slight calluses developing on her hands from honest work, the way her eyes reflected the last light of day. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand, to say something about the feelings that had been growing inside him since that first moment in the town square. But fear held him back. What if she did not feel the same way? What if she saw him only as her rescuer and benefactor, someone she was grateful to but not romantically interested in? The thought of making her uncomfortable or ruining the easy friendship they had developed kept him silent, but the wanting did not go away. It grew stronger with each passing day, until he felt like he was carrying a constant ache in his chest that only eased when she smiled at him. Harold noticed, of course, because Harold noticed everything that happened on his ranch. He pulled Benjamin aside one morning while they were checking fence lines in the north pasture, his expression serious but not unkind. You need to tell that girl how you feel before you drive yourself crazy with wanting. I do not know what you are talking about, Benjamin tried to deflect, but Harold cut him off with a dismissive wave. Do not play dumb with me, son. You look at Lillian the way a dying man looks at water. She looks at you the same way, in case you had not noticed. You are both dancing around something that is plain as day to everyone else on this ranch. Benjamin felt his heart skip at Harold's words. She looks at me that way, like you hung the moon and stars, Harold confirmed. Martha says Lillian asks about you constantly when you are out working, wanting to know when you will be back and if you are safe. That is not the behavior of someone who just sees you as a friend, Benjamin. But I own her legally, Benjamin said, finally voicing the concern that had been gnawing at him. How can I court her or confess feelings when there is that kind of power imbalance between us? She might feel obligated to return my affections because she thinks she owes me something. Harold nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of the concern. That is a fair point, and it shows you are thinking about her well-being and not just your own desires. Here is what I suggest. Go to Columbia next week, find a lawyer, and draw up papers freeing Lillian from that contract. give her complete legal independence, and then court her properly as a free woman. If she returns your feelings after that, you will know it is genuine and not born from any sense of obligation." The advice was sound, and Benjamin wondered why he had not thought of it himself. The answer was that he had been so caught up in his feelings and fears that he had not been thinking clearly. "You are right," he said. "I will do that this coming Saturday." "Good," Harold said with satisfaction. "Now, let us get this fence mended before the cattle decide to explore the neighbor's property." The week crawled by with agonizing slowness, each day feeling like a month as Benjamin counted down to Saturday. He did not tell Lillian what he was planning, wanting to have everything arranged before he explained his intentions. She seemed to sense that something was occupying his thoughts, asking once if everything was all right, but she did not press when he assured her it was just ranch business on his mind. Saturday morning finally arrived, and Benjamin set out for Columbia with the folded contract in his saddlebag. The ride gave him too much time to think, to second-guess himself, to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. What if freeing Lillian made her decide to leave the ranch and strike out on her own? What if she accepted her freedom and then politely declined his romantic interest? What if he was misreading the signs that Harold insisted were there? The lawyer's office was located above the bank, a cramped space filled with law books and the musty smell of old paper. The lawyer himself, a thin man named Gregory Foster, listened to Benjamin's explanation and examined the contract with professional detachment. "This is straightforward enough," Foster said after a few minutes of study. "I can draw up manumission papers that will legally release Miss Vance from any obligation to you. It will cost you $5 for my services." Benjamin paid the fee gladly, watching as Foster carefully drafted the document in his precise handwriting. The lawyer explained each section as he wrote, ensuring that Benjamin understood exactly what he was signing. The papers would take effect immediately upon both parties signing them, and Lillian would be free to go wherever she wished and do whatever she wanted without any legal ties to Benjamin. "You are doing the right thing," Foster commented as he applied his seal to the finished document. Not many men would voluntarily give up ownership of property they had paid good money for. "She is not property," Benjamin said sharply. "She is a person who deserves her freedom." "I meant no offense," Foster said mildly. "I was simply noting that your sense of morality is refreshing in these times. I hope Miss Vance appreciates what you have done for her." Benjamin left the office with the papers safely tucked in his coat, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He stopped at the general store to purchase a few supplies, and Mrs. Henderson greeted him with her usual warmth. "How is our Lillian doing?" she asked as she wrapped his purchases. "She is doing wonderfully," Benjamin reported honestly. "Martha says she has never had better help, and Lillian is learning ranching skills like she was born to it. She seems happy, or at least as happy as someone can be after what she went through." "And how are you doing, Benjamin?" Mrs. Henderson asked with a knowing look. "Martha was in here last week and mentioned that you and Lillian spend a lot of time together." Benjamin felt his cheeks heat with embarrassment. "We are friends," he said carefully. "She is learning and I am teaching. That is all. If you say so, Mrs. Henderson replied with a smile that suggested she did not believe him for a moment. "But if you should happen to realize that it is more than friendship, do not wait too long to say something. Life is short and opportunities do not come around twice." The ride back to the ranch seemed to take half the time the journey to Columbia had required, and Benjamin found himself at the property boundary before he felt ready. He took his time with his horse, brushing the animal down and checking its hooves with more thoroughness than necessary, delaying the moment when he would have to face Lillian and either change everything between them or confirm that his feelings were one-sided. He found her in the garden behind the main house, kneeling between rows of vegetables and pulling weeds with steady efficiency. The afternoon sun caught the copper highlights in her hair, and her face was flushed with exertion and heat. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps and smiled with such genuine pleasure at seeing him that Benjamin felt his breath catch in his throat. "You are back," she said, sitting back on her heels and wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "How was Colombia?" "Did you get everything you needed?" "I did," Benjamin said, his mouth suddenly dry. "I need to talk to you about something important. Can you take a break from the garden?" Concern flickered across Lillian's face, but she nodded and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Of course." "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing is wrong," Benjamin assured her quickly. "I just have something I need to give you and some things I need to say." They walked to a bench under a large oak tree that provided shade and privacy. Benjamin sat down and Lillian settled beside him, her expression attentive and slightly worried. He pulled the folded papers from his coat pocket and held them out to her. "What is this?" Lillian asked, not taking them yet. "Freedom," Benjamin said simply. "These are legal documents releasing you from the contract that bound you to me. I went to Colombia today and had a lawyer draw them up properly. If you sign them, you will be completely free, with no legal obligation to me or anyone else." Lillian stared at the papers as though they might bite her, making no move to accept them. "I do not understand. Why would you do this now?" "Because it is what you deserve," Benjamin said, his heart hammering so hard he could barely hear his own voice. "When I bought your freedom at that auction, I did it because I could not stand to see you treated as property. But the truth is that transaction just transferred ownership from that salesman to me, and that is not real freedom. This is real freedom, Lillian. No strings attached, no obligations, no debts. You can stay here at the ranch if you want, or you can leave and go anywhere you choose. It is entirely up to you." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes as she finally took the papers, her hands trembling as she unfolded them and read the legal language that set her free. "You are really just giving this to me, asking nothing in return." "I am asking nothing in return," Benjamin confirmed, though the words cost him dearly because he wanted so much to ask for everything. "You have thanked me enough already through your hard work and your friendship. You do not owe me anything beyond that. But what if I want to owe you something?" Lillian asked softly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart stop. "What if I want there to be strings attached?" Benjamin felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment you bid on me at that auction," Lillian said, the words tumbling out in a rush as though she was afraid if she did not say them quickly she would lose her courage. "I know it is probably foolish and probably too soon, but I cannot stop thinking about you. I cannot stop being grateful that you exist in the world, that you are the kind of man who would sacrifice everything to save a stranger. I watch you work and teach me things, and I just want to be near you all the time. And if signing these papers means you are trying to let me go, then I do not want to sign them, because I do not want to go anywhere that you are not." Benjamin could scarcely believe what he was hearing, could barely process the words that were everything he had hoped for but been too afraid to expect. "You love me?" he asked, needing to hear her confirm it again. "I do," Lillian said, laughing through her tears. "I love you, Benjamin Dawson. And I will sign these papers proving I am free, and then I will choose to stay here with you because that is what I want, not because anyone is forcing me or because I feel obligated." "I love you too," Benjamin said, the words feeling inadequate to express the depth of what he felt but the best he had to offer. I have loved you since I saw your eyes in that cage, since I heard you speak and realized you were the strongest person I had ever met. I wanted to wait until you were free to tell you, because I did not want you to think your feelings were required or expected." Lillian signed the papers right there on the bench, her signature shaky but determined, and then she folded them carefully and handed them back to Benjamin. "There," she said. "Now I am completely free and I am freely choosing to love you. What are we going to do about it?" Benjamin took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his, how right it felt to touch her without fear or hesitation. "I would like to court you properly," he said formally, "with the intention of eventually asking you to marry me, if you are willing." "I am very willing," Lillian said, squeezing his fingers, "but we need to be practical too. You spent all your money to buy my freedom, and now you need to rebuild your savings if you are ever going to get that land you want. I will keep working and saving my wages, and we will get there together." "Together," Benjamin repeated, loving the sound of the word. "I would like that very much." Their courtship over the following months was the subject of much quiet approval from everyone at the ranch. Harold and Martha were delighted to see them happy together, and even the other ranch hands expressed their support in the awkward but genuine way of men who were not accustomed to dealing with romance. Benjamin and Lillian spent every free moment together, talking and working and dreaming about the future they were building. Lillian proved to be not just willing but gifted at ranch work, picking up skills that usually took years to develop. She learned to ride well enough to help move cattle, to rope and doctor sick animals, to make repairs and improvements that saved the ranch money. Harold began paying her more than he had originally offered, insisting that her work was worth the higher wage and that she had earned it through her dedication. Benjamin returned to his regime of saving every spare penny, but now Lillian was saving alongside him, both of them contributing to the fund that would eventually buy their land. They discussed their plans endlessly, refining the vision of the ranch they would build, deciding together what kind of cattle to raise and where to position the house for the best light and views. The dream that Benjamin had once held alone was now shared, and somehow that made it feel more real and achievable. One evening in late autumn, almost exactly a year after the auction, Benjamin asked Harold for permission to speak with him privately. They sat in Harold's study, and Benjamin explained that he wanted to ask Lillian to marry him, but felt he should ask for Harold's blessing first, since Harold had become something like a father to him. Harold's eyes grew suspiciously bright as he clasped Benjamin's shoulder and gave his wholehearted approval. "That girl is the best thing that ever happened to you," Harold said gruffly, "and you are the best thing that ever happened to her. You have both worked hard and proven yourselves, and I cannot think of two people who deserve happiness more." Benjamin proposed the next Saturday, riding with Lillian to the piece of land he had originally wanted to buy. Old Marcus Thornfield had agreed to hold the property for them, impressed by their determination to purchase it the right way rather than taking out a risky loan. They stood on the hill overlooking the creek, and Benjamin got down on one knee in the golden grass. "Lillian Vance, I loved you before I knew your name, and I will love you until the day I die," Benjamin said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Will you marry me and build this dream together as my wife?" "Yes," Lillian said through happy tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in Columbia 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church with everyone from the ranch in attendance. Mrs. Henderson cried happy tears, and Martha fussed over Lillian's dress, which was new and white and had been the subject of much excited planning. Benjamin wore his best clothes, and thought he had never seen anything more beautiful than Lillian walking toward him with joy shining in her eyes. The wedding night was spent in the hotel in Colombia, the only extravagance they allowed themselves, and the intimacy they shared was tender and sweet, and everything that first times should be. Benjamin held Lillian in his arms afterward, and marveled at the path his life had taken, how a single impulsive decision had led him to this moment of perfect happiness. They returned to the ranch the next day as husband and wife, moving into the room that had been Lillian's into a space that was now officially theirs. Harold had given them a week off work as a wedding present, but they spent most of it on the ranch anyway, too eager about their plans to rest. They rode out to their land every day, walking the property and making detailed plans for where everything would go. It took them another full year to save enough money to purchase the land outright, and the day they signed the papers in Marcus Thornfield's presence was almost as joyful as their wedding day. The land was theirs, legally and completely, bought not with a desperate gesture but with the steady accumulation of honest wages earned side by side. They broke ground on their house the following spring, and Benjamin built it with his own hands with help from Harold and the other ranch hands. The house rose slowly through the summer, taking shape exactly as Benjamin had envisioned it years before. Lillian worked alongside him whenever she could, learning carpentry and proving to be skilled with her hands. They moved into the unfinished house in the autumn, sleeping on a bedroll in what would eventually be their bedroom, and cooking over a fireplace that was one of the few completed features. "It is not much yet," Benjamin said one evening as they sat on the porch steps watching the sunset, the same view he had imagined all those years ago. "It is everything," Lillian corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It is ours, built by our hands, bought with our work. I would not trade it for a mansion." Their first cattle arrived that winter, a small herd that they planned to grow over time. Benjamin proved to be as skilled a rancher on his own land as he had been working for Harold, and Lillian matched him in every task. They worked from dawn to dusk, exhausted and happy, building something real and lasting. The following spring brought news that transformed their joy into something even deeper. Lillian was pregnant, the baby due to arrive in the late autumn. Benjamin was terrified and elated in equal measure, hovering over Lillian and trying to prevent her from doing heavy work, earning himself gentle teasing about being overprotective. "I am healthy and strong," Lillian assured him for the 100th time. "This baby is lucky to have you as a father already, the way you worry." Their son was born on a cool November night with Martha serving as midwife. Benjamin paced outside the bedroom door, listening to Lillian's labored breathing and feeling utterly helpless. When Martha finally emerged with a tiny bundle and a huge smile, Benjamin felt his knees go weak with relief. "You have a son," Martha announced. "A big healthy boy with his father's lungs based on the noise he is making. Lillian is tired but doing well, and she is asking for you." Benjamin entered the bedroom to find Lillian propped up on pillows, looking exhausted and beautiful and triumphant. The baby in her arms had a shock of dark hair and a red face scrunched up in protest at the indignity of being born. Benjamin sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand with wonder. "He is perfect," Benjamin said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. I cannot believe we made him." "We did," Lillian agreed softly. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly, but never quite settled on one that felt right. Now, looking at his son's face, Benjamin knew exactly what he wanted to call him. "James," he said. "After your father. He made mistakes, but he gave me you, and that deserves to be honored." Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks at the suggestion. "James Benjamin Dawson," she said, testing the full name. "I think it is perfect." Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house, chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Little James proved to have his mother's temperament, generally happy but with a stubborn streak that promised interesting years ahead. Benjamin continued building and improving their ranch, while Lillian juggled childcare with her share of the work, refusing to become only a mother when she had worked so hard to be a rancher too. Harold and Martha became honorary grandparents, stopping by frequently to check on the baby and offer help when needed. The bonds between the two families deepened, built on shared work and mutual respect and genuine affection. Harold began talking about Benjamin eventually buying some of his land to expand, hinting that he and Martha were considering retirement in a few years. The years flowed past like water, marked by the steady growth of their son and their ranch. They added a daughter named Charlotte when James was 3, a tiny girl with her mother's auburn hair and green eyes. 2 years after that came another son they named Samuel, who was quieter than his siblings but observant and clever. Their house expanded to accommodate the growing family, rooms added one at a time as money and time allowed. Benjamin stood on his porch one evening when he was 35 years old, watching his 3 children play in the yard while Lillian hung laundry in the last light of day. 12 years had passed since that auction in Columbia. 12 years that had transformed him from a lonely cowboy with nothing but savings and dreams into a husband, father, and successful rancher. He thought about the moment when he had seen Lillian in that cage, the instant when his life had split into before and after. Lillian finished with the laundry and came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his with the easy comfort of long familiarity. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, reading his contemplative mood. "Everything," Benjamin said honestly. "How much has changed, how lucky I am, how close I came to never knowing you existed." "I think about that too sometimes," Lillian admitted. "All the small choices that had to happen exactly right for us to meet. If that salesman had chosen a different town for his auction, if you had come to Columbia a day earlier or later, if you had not had exactly the right amount of money saved. It is terrifying how easily we might have missed each other." "But we did not miss each other," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "We found each other and we built this life together, and I have never regretted spending that money, not for one single moment." "I know," Lillian said softly, "and I have spent every day trying to be worth that sacrifice." "You have been worth so much more than money," Benjamin told her firmly. "You are my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. Everything I have is richer because you are here to share it with me." They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching their children play and listening to the sounds of their ranch settling down for the night. The cattle lowed in the distance, the horses moved in their corral, and somewhere an owl hooted its hunting call. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary life, and it was absolutely extraordinary. Charlotte ran up to the porch, her dress dirty and her hair escaping from its braids. "Mama, Papa, James says I cannot help move the cattle tomorrow, but I am big enough now, aren't I?" "You are getting big," Lillian agreed diplomatically. "But moving cattle is hard work that requires skill. How about you practice your riding a bit more, and then we will see about letting you help." Charlotte pouted but accepted the ruling, running back to her brothers with the resilience of childhood. Benjamin watched her go with a smile, seeing in her the same determination and spirit that had drawn him to Lillian from the first moment. "She is going to be a handful when she gets older," Lillian observed with amusement. "Just like her mother," Benjamin teased, earning himself an elbow in the ribs. The children eventually tired and came inside for supper, filling the house with noise and laughter and the controlled chaos of family life. Benjamin sat at the head of the table he had built with his own hands, in the house he had constructed board by board, and looked at the faces of his wife and children. This was what he had been saving for all those years ago, even if he had not known it at the time. Not just land and cattle and buildings, but a family, a legacy, a love that would endure beyond his own lifetime. After the children were bathed and tucked into bed, Benjamin and Lillian sat on their porch in the cool evening air. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by city lights, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and cattle and home. Benjamin reached for Lillian's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I love you," he said, simple words that contained multitudes. "I love you too," Lillian replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for saving me, Benjamin. Thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving when the rest of that crowd saw only property." "Thank you for choosing to stay," Benjamin responded. "For building this life with me and making all those years of saving mean something more than I ever imagined possible." They sat in contented silence, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something lasting from a single impulsive act of courage and compassion. The land stretched out around them, their land, bought not once but twice, first with money and then with love and labor and commitment. The house behind them held their sleeping children, the future they were raising with patience and hope. The years ahead promised challenges and joys, hardships and triumphs, but they would face them together, as they had faced everything since that day in Colombia. Benjamin thought again about the moment when he had emptied his savings onto that table, the moment when his hand had moved faster than his rational mind could stop it. He had thought he was giving up his dreams that day, sacrificing years of work for a stranger's freedom. But he had been wrong. He had not given up his dreams at all. He had simply been paying for better ones than he had known enough to imagine. Dreams that included auburn hair catching the sunlight, green eyes that saw into his soul, and 3 children who were the living proof that the best things in life were worth any sacrifice. "Come to bed," Lillian said eventually, standing and pulling him up beside her. "Tomorrow is another early day and those cattle will not tend themselves." Benjamin followed her inside, through the house they had built together, past the rooms where their children slept peacefully, to the bedroom where they had shared so many nights. He pulled Lillian close as they lay down, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist, their breathing synchronizing in the unconscious harmony of long intimacy. "Happy," Lillian murmured, already half asleep. "Happier than I ever knew was possible," Benjamin answered truthfully. And as he drifted off to sleep with his wife in his arms and his children safe under his roof and his land stretching out around them in all directions, Benjamin knew with absolute certainty that he would make the same choice again. He would spend every penny he had, sacrifice every dream he held, and count it the best investment he ever made, because it had bought him not just Lillian's freedom but his own. Freedom from loneliness, freedom from the half-life of living only for yourself, freedom to love and be loved with the fierce dedication that transformed ordinary lives into something transcendent. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of their family and ranch. James grew into a serious young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's analytical mind. Charlotte became the daring one, climbing trees and riding faster than safety probably warranted, keeping her parents constantly worried and proud in equal measure. Samuel proved to have a gift for numbers and planning, traits that would serve the ranch well as he grew older. When Benjamin was 40 years old, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep, and the ranch he had built passed to Martha, who promptly sold it to Benjamin for a price far below market value. "Harold always thought of you as the son we never had," Martha explained when Benjamin protested the generous terms. "He wanted you to have the land, to expand your operation and provide for your family. Besides, I am moving to town to be near my sister, and I know this land will be in good hands with you." The additional property more than doubled the size of Benjamin's holdings, transforming him from a modest rancher into a significant landowner. He hired workers to help manage the expanded operation, teaching them with the same patience Harold had once shown him. Lillian remained his partner in all things, her voice equal to his in every decision that shaped their enterprise. Their children grew and learned, and eventually began making their own choices about the future. James announced at 18 that he wanted to continue the ranch, to build on what his parents had created and pass it to his own children someday. Charlotte surprised everyone by declaring her intention to become a teacher, wanting to help other children learn and grow as she had been helped. Samuel proved interested in the business side of ranching, talking about markets and contracts with an enthusiasm that made Benjamin proud, even though he did not fully understand all the details. Benjamin and Lillian watched their children forge their own paths with the bittersweet pride of parents who had raised them to be independent. The house that had once been filled with the noise of little ones grew quieter as the children matured and began preparing to leave. Charlotte was the first to go, heading to Sacramento for teacher training when she turned 20. James stayed on the ranch, building a small house of his own on the property in preparation for the day when he would marry and have his own family. Samuel split his time between the ranch and town, establishing connections that would help them sell their cattle at better prices. When Benjamin was 50 years old, he stood on the same hill where he had proposed to Lillian all those years ago and looked out over the empire they had built together. The original 160 acres had grown to over 1,000, with several houses, multiple barns, and hundreds of head of cattle. The success was gratifying, but it paled in comparison to the knowledge that he and Lillian had raised 3 good people who were making their own marks on the world. Lillian came to stand beside him, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes as green and piercing as ever. "Remembering?" she asked, knowing him well enough to read his contemplative mood. "Always," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "I was just thinking about that day at the auction, how young and foolish I was." "You were not foolish," Lillian protested. "You were brave and good and wonderful." "I was terrified," Benjamin admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing or how things would work out. I just knew I could not walk away and leave you there." "And I am grateful every single day that you did not walk away," Lillian said softly. "You gave me my life back that day, Benjamin. Everything I am, everything we built together, it all started because you had the courage to do what was right even when it cost you everything." "It did not cost me everything," Benjamin corrected gently. "It cost me money, but it gave me everything that actually matters. You, our children, this life we have shared. I got the better end of that bargain by far." They stood together in the afternoon sun, 2 people who had weathered decades together and come out stronger for it. Their love had deepened over the years, transforming from the passionate intensity of youth into something richer and more complex. They knew each other's flaws and strengths, fears and hopes, and they loved each other not despite those things but because of them. "I am glad I fell into that cage," Lillian said suddenly, and Benjamin looked at her in surprise. "That is a strange thing to be glad about." "I know, but it is true. If my father had not made his terrible bargain, if I had not ended up in Colombia on exactly the day you were there, we never would have met. All the suffering and fear was worth it because it led me to you. I would have preferred a way for us to meet that did not involve you suffering," Benjamin said firmly. But I understand what you mean. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives set us on the path to the best ones. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their steps slower than they had once been, but no less certain. The years had marked them both, lines etched into their faces and gray threading through their hair. But Benjamin thought Lillian had never been more beautiful than she was now. Her beauty earned through years of living and loving and building something meaningful. More years passed, bringing grandchildren who filled the house with laughter and chaos that reminded Benjamin and Lillian of their own child-rearing years. James married a kind woman named Sarah and had 4 children who inherited their grandmother's auburn hair and their grandfather's steady temperament. Charlotte married a teacher she met in Sacramento and had twin girls who were as energetic and daring as their mother. Samuel eventually married and settled in town, but he remained closely involved in the ranch operations, managing their business affairs with skill that freed Benjamin to focus on the land and cattle he loved. When Benjamin was 65 years old, he officially retired from active ranch management, turning the operation over to James while remaining available for advice and assistance. He and Lillian spent their days quietly, tending a large garden, reading and spoiling their grandchildren with the indulgence that grandparents were entitled to. The house they had built so many years ago now hosted regular gatherings of their extended family, celebrations and holidays that filled every room with love and laughter. One evening in late summer, sitting on the porch that had been the site of so many important conversations over the years, Lillian asked Benjamin if he had any regrets about how his life had unfolded. "Not a single one," Benjamin answered without hesitation. "Every choice I made, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt or fear, it all led me here. To you, to our family, to this life we built together. How could I regret any of that? Even spending all your savings on a girl you had never met?" Lillian asked with a smile. "Especially that," Benjamin said firmly. "That was the single best decision I ever made, the moment when my life truly began. Everything before that auction was just preparation, and everything after has been the reward for having the courage to do what my heart told me was right." "I love you, Benjamin Dawson," Lillian said, the same words she had spoken countless times over the decades, but which never lost their power or meaning. "I love you, Lillian Dawson," Benjamin replied, his voice rich with the accumulated affection of a lifetime shared. "Today, tomorrow, and forever." As the sun set over the land they had claimed and cultivated and made their own, Benjamin reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with an impulsive bid at an auction in Colombia. He had saved for years to buy land, planning a future he thought he understood. But when the moment came, he had spent it all to free a girl whose eyes held defiance and courage, and a desperate hope for mercy. That single choice had given him not the life he planned, but something infinitely better. A love story that spanned decades and generations. A legacy built not on property and possessions, but on compassion, courage, and commitment. Their story became something of a legend in the region, told and retold until the details became somewhat embellished with each recounting. But the core truth remained constant. A young cowboy had sacrificed his dreams to save a stranger, and in doing so had found something far more valuable than the land he thought he wanted. He had found love, partnership, purpose, and a family that would carry his and Lillian's values forward into future generations. Benjamin lived to be 82 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep with Lillian holding his hand. His last conscious thought was gratitude for the life he had lived, the woman he had loved, and the family they had created together. Lillian followed him 3 years later, her final words a whispered repetition of his name and the assurance that she would see him soon. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking their ranch, the land they had fought for and earned and loved for more than half a century. Their gravestone bore a simple inscription that told their entire story in just a few words. He saved her. She saved him. Together they built a legacy of love.